Hey everybody, it's Ron, and I want to tell you a story about business and how that story changed everything. It's early morning on July 8th, 1853. A small port town at the entrance to Edo Bay, about 30 miles south of the capital. The water's calm, fishing boats are already out, vendors along the shore are setting up for the day. It is, by every measure, an ordinary morning. Then someone looks up. 4 ships are moving into the harbor under a cloud of black smoke. Not a sail in sight. No wind filling canvas, no oars pulling at the water. The ships are moving on their own, against the current, trailing columns of dark smoke from iron stacks, the likes of which nobody standing on that shore had ever seen. Japanese artists who sketch the ships in the days that follow will draw the figureheads on the boats as leering monsters. They will describe the vessels as darkness incarnate. One account calls them giant dragons puffing smoke. For a fishing village that has lived its entire existence inside 2 centuries of deliberate national isolation, there is simply no framework for what is sitting in the harbor. And then there is a man on that same shore who does have a framework. A Tokugawa official, one of the administrators of the shogunate, the military government that has kept Japan closed to the outside world since 1639. He knows exactly what those ships represent. He has heard the rumor circulating among Japanese leadership for months that the Americans were coming, that they wanted ports opened, that they were not the kind of visitors who took no for an answer. He watches the ships and he understands 2 things simultaneously. The first is that those vessels are carrying weapons his government has no answer for. The second is that the system he serves, the one that has held the outside world at bay for over 200 years, has just run out of time. So, how do you watch the world you've kept out for 2 centuries sail into your harbor under its own power, bristling with cannons, and find a response equal to that moment? How does a government that has maintained total control over what comes in and what goes out reckon with a force that simply ignores the rules it has spent generations enforcing? And how did that morning on July 8th, 1853, set in motion a chain of events that would transform Japan from a feudal society into an industrial power in under 50 years and permanently change how the world thinks about the relationship between military force and trade? From Business Basics, I'm Ron Trucks, and this is Business History, the daily podcast where we explain the stories that changed business forever. Every date on the calendar has a story where business reshaped the world. Today, July 8th, that story takes us to 1853, the arrival of the Black Ships. For more than 2 centuries, Japan had kept the world out on purpose. The policy was called Sakoku, closed country. And the Tokugawa shogunate, the military government that had ruled Japan since the early 1600s, enforced it with absolute consistency. One port, Nagasaki, handled limited trade with Dutch and Chinese merchants under conditions so controlled that foreign traders were confined to a small, artificial island in the harbor and forbidden from setting foot on Japanese soil. Everything else was locked out. No foreign ships, no foreign missionaries, no foreign ideas that hadn't been filtered through the shogunate first. Japanese citizens who left the country were forbidden from returning, and that policy had held since 1639. Now, it wasn't paranoia. It was a deliberate economic and political calculation. The shogunate understood that trade relationships caused dependencies, and dependencies created leverage, and leverage in the hands of foreign powers was a threat to the stability of the regime. Isolation was control. For over 200 years, it worked. But what changed wasn't Japan. What changed was the world around it. By the early 1850s, American commercial interests in the Pacific were expanding rapidly. Whaling fleets operated across the ocean. Steam-powered ships needed coaling stations along the trans-Pacific routes. California had just become a state, and American merchants were looking hard at Asia as the next commercial frontier. Japan sat directly across the most important shipping lanes in the Pacific, and its ports were closed. President Millard Fillmore sent Commodore Matthew Perry with a letter requesting open trade and diplomatic relations, and with 4 warships carrying 73 state-of-the-art exploding shell guns to make the request difficult to decline. Perry was not a subtle man. Japanese authorities ordered him to proceed to Nagasaki, the only port where foreigners were permitted. Perry ignored them. He sailed directly into Edo Bay instead, past the harbor at Uraga toward the capital itself. The message was not in the letter. The message was in where he chose to anchor. The ships that appeared in Uraga Harbor on the morning of July 8, 1853, were unlike anything the Japanese had encountered. 2 steam-powered frigates towing 2 sailing sloops, moving against the current without a sail deployed, trailing columns of black smoke from those iron stacks. Japanese artists who sketched the vessels in the days that followed drew, as I mentioned, those figureheads as leering monsters, with one account describing them as giant dragons puffing smoke. The name that spread through Edo and the surrounding communities was kurofune, black ships. It wasn't a compliment. Perry orchestrated every deal of the encounter for psychological effect. He remained out of sight in his cabin, conducting all negotiations through intermediaries, a calculated display of rank that signaled he considered no Japanese official senior enough to meet with directly. When smaller Japanese boats rowed out to intercept the squadron, crewed by samurai in traditional armor, Perry's gunners kept their stations. The power differential was visible and deliberate. Wooden boats against steam-powered warships with exploding shells. There was no version of that confrontation where the outcome was ambiguous. The Tokugawa shogunate did something it had never done before. It was facing a demand it had no military answer for. So it asked the Japanese public, the regional lords and their advisors, what it should do. Opinion was divided between resistance and accommodation. Neither side really had a good answer. The shogunate accepted Perry's letter from President Fillmore and told him to return the following year for a response. Perry returned about 6 months later, in February 1854, with 9 ships instead of 4. The Treaty of Kanagawa was signed on March 31, 1854, opening the ports of Shimoda and Hakodate to American ships. More treaties with Britain, Russia, and the Netherlands followed within months. 215 years of self-imposed isolation ended not with a negotiation, but with a demonstration of what happened when negotiation was declined. The domestic consequences arrived faster than the trade. The shogunate's inability to resist Perry's demands was read across Japan as evidence of fatal weakness. The movement to overthrow the Tokugawa government began almost immediately, drawing on samurai, intellectuals, and regional lords who believed Japan's survival required a different kind of leadership. By 1868, the shogunate was gone. What Japan did next is the business story. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 brought a new imperial government to power under Emperor Matsuhito, whose reign name became Meiji, which meant enlightened rule. The new government looked at what Perry's ships had revealed, the technological and industrial gap between Japan and the Western powers, and made a decision that would define the next 50 years. Rather than resist Western models, Japan would study them, adopt them, and build a competitor. The feudal class system was abolished. Railroads and telegraph networks went up across the country. A modern banking system replaced the shogunate's financial structures. The government sent hundreds of students abroad to study Western engineering, law, medicine, and military organization, and brought Western experts to Japan to teach what couldn't be learned at a distance. The Charter Oath of 1868 committed the new government to seeking knowledge from across the world and abandoning customs that no longer served the nation. It was an explicit institutional mandate to learn from the people who had just forced the door open. Perry had seen it coming. Before leaving Japan in 1854, he told his officers that the Japanese would enter as powerful competitors in the race for mechanical success. He was right faster than he expected. Japanese imports and exports grew from roughly 45 million between 1878 and 1882 to over 440 million by 1908 to 1912, a tenfold increase in 30 years. In 1905, Japan defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War, the first time in the modern era that an Asian nation had defeated a European power in open conflict. The industrial engine that made that possible had been built in under 40 years from a standing start. The word kurofune outlasted everything. It's still used in Japanese today, applied to any foreign disruption that forces an unwanted transformation on an industry or institution that thought it was protected, a new technology that breaks an existing market, a foreign competitor that enters a closed industry, a platform that rewrites the rules before the incumbents understand what's happening. Black ships. The pattern Perry demonstrated in Edo Bay in 1853 has repeated itself across industries and economies ever since. The question it always asks is the same one the Tokugawa shogunate faced on the morning of July 8th. Not whether the door opens. What do you do when it does? I'm Ron Trucks, and this is Business History, the podcast that finds the turning points behind the headlines. To hear more stories like this, follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen. And if you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to subscribe and leave a quick review. It helps more people find the story behind the business. And if you want to actually understand business better without the fluff or the buzzwords or the MBA language, start by visiting us at businessdailypodcast.com.